Hello and welcome to Man of the Prize, the podcast. It is me, your host, Harvey. How are you? How's your day going? How's your week going? How's the summer been for you? Are you doing well? I hope you are doing well. I hope you've kept your sanity. If you're a father, you probably had a lot of time with your kids, and I hope you keep it, and I hope you're staying well and still being the great father that you are. If you don't have kids and it's just been active, and if life has been hectic, I hope you're keeping up with it because we know how hard life can be. No matter what trials, tribulations, that stuff will come, but you're able to maintain. And I'm proud for everything that you've done. And today is just one day. This is another great episode. And before I get started, I wanted to talk about a word that I deal with as a Black man. And the word is perception. I've grown up as a man, as a Black man, knowing that a lot of what I deal with in the world is how I've seen, how I'm perceived. If you are a man, there's one perception, but if you're a Black man, it's something different. If I'm walking around and I may walk by a car, I may hear those locks because they're concerned about what I may do. Or, somebody may see me on the street and cross the street and not want to walk on the same side of the street as I am because they see a Black man. A lot of how we men live is perception. And it's important to know that we can't live our lives based on what other people think of us, that we have to be ourselves. And those other people, they be damned because they don't know you. They just see the outer, they see this perfect visage. They see this man. Oh my, look at this man. But they don't really know. And that's my joke for this episode. But with that said, what's important about perception is we don't let it affect us, but it's going to happen. And the perception of men is such a big part of life right now. We are in this stage where I know at times as a man, I feel like I'm automatically the villain when things happen. When anything happens, I am automatically the bad guy. And a lot of men, we deal with that. And I follow a few people on social media who I think kind of talk about this. There's the Tin Men on Instagram, which I love. Fantastic page. And another person I follow is my guest this week, and his name is Phil Mitchell. Let's bring him in. Mr. Mitchell, welcome to Men of the Prize. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for answering. I appreciate it. I'm glad that you did. We are going to have a little bit of a different conversation. A if you typically listen or watch this podcast, I usually go through the prize mantra. We're not going to do that this time because I think what we're talking about is more important, just in case, than the actual mantra that I usually go with. So, but I will still tell you who we're speaking to, and that is Phil Mitchell, who is a counselor, psychotherapist, author, supervisor, and trainer with 20 years experience working with boys and men who have experienced various forms of abuse. So when I saw that, and that's what you talk about, that's why the idea of perception came to mind, because of subjects about men and how they're perceived, how they aren't taken as seriously as others. So I want to start with that. And the word I feel that fits it is misandry. And you spent a lot of time talking about misandry. Just to get started, would you mind kind of giving us a layman's definition of
Uh,
misandry?
a very simple layman's definition would be the hatred of men. A slightly more detailed, arguably more accurate definition would be the hatred of men because they're men. And perhaps an even more sort of clearer definition perhaps could be the hatred, contempt, dislike, disrespect, prejudice towards slash of men because they're men. So I think a lot of people often will say, oh, well, that's not hatred of men. And in some cases, that's true. It might not be absolute hatred, but it's on the scale of dislike and contempt. So in a nutshell, there is that word. But what's very interesting, a lot of people, a lot of men, never heard of the word. They don't know it. They don't even know it exists. I'm part of an online quiz with some friends that live down south, and we meet every now and then. We meet online and we chat. And a man who's in the group, he said, Phil, what is misandry? I've never heard of it. And isn't it interesting how? I mean, do you know what misogyny is? Oh yeah, of course. Of course you do. Maybe we should be asking why you've heard of misogyny but never misandry.
Well, then here's the question. Why is it that misandry is a word that's not spoken a lot about. Why is that kind of in the shadows? Why is that hidden? What do you think?
Well, I think the answer to that question is because we live in a world that cares significantly more about the suffering and disadvantage affecting girls and women, and we care significantly less, perhaps even not at all, about the suffering and disadvantage of boys and men. That is why. And some people try and justify that. Some people poorly justify that. And then, of course, you've got the whole deniers out there that say misandry doesn't exist, and then they follow that on by displaying misandry. So
Mhm.
it's very odd.
Yes, it is. And so I think about that. Is it possible? Well, is one of the reasons, if maybe not the reason, that misandry is not talked about because misogyny is essentially the way men treat women negatively and such. Is that the reason why men don't get to have that? That's what it feels like. We don't get to have bad things happen to us.
I think that's possibly part of it, but I'd go a little bit more deeper than that because I think it's not as simple as how men treat women and how women treat men, and I have these, well, not anymore. I kind of do my best to step back from debates on social media because you're never going to get them to change their mind. You just hate
Right.
and horribleness and all of that. But when I have had interesting discussions and debates, I say it's not about women or men hating men. It's about the attitude of misandry. And men are quite capable of holding the attitude of misandry, and that influences their behaviour towards other men. So often what we hear is, oh, we live in a patriarchy. I mean, we can have a whole podcast on that, but what is patriarchy, how we're defining it, how do we measure it, what does it mean, and lots of different definitions. That if we just go with the definition of, well, it's society by men, for men, run by men, to advantage men, to privilege men, or to benefit men, well, I would argue that the patriarchy or government, certainly here in the UK, does considerably more to help girls and women than boys and men. And I believe that on some level, the attitude of misandry, contempt for men, dislike for men, prejudice against men, that attitude influences their behaviour. And so the idea that men, whoever they are, men cannot hold misandristic views is false. It's not about whether the person holding that view is a man or a woman, although that might be an interesting dynamic to explore. It's more about the attitude itself.
You went right into the question. It's a question that as a black man, as a black person, we get in a lot of cases. Is it possible for black people to be racist towards each other? And definitely. So I was really going to go with, is it possible for men to be misandrist? I guess if that's the proper word. And if they are, why? Where did that come from?
Oh, I mean, there's a big question.
Yeah.
Again, there is research. Again, I can't remember the details as I sit here right now, but there is various studies that show when you take a group of men and a group of women, uh, both groups will show consideration and care and love and concern and worry a lot more for women than men. Uh, is that an instinct? Is it a societal issue? Is it a bit of both? I guess that's an interesting discussion. Um, but I guess this is an issue that we have to look at because there's been other studies as well that show that if you have a man enduring pain or a woman enduring pain, what you find is that groups of men and groups of women will, everybody thought that, oh, well, the men will care about the men and the women will care about the women. No, the women cared more about the woman, and the men cared more about the women. There's studies like this all over the place. Now, some might say yes, but men have got a greater pain threshold than women. So even if that's true, it doesn't justify or excuse perpetrating abuse against them that will cause them physical pain. That's a little bit like saying, a medium-sized dog can take a lot more pain or slightly more pain than a tiny little kitten. you don't hurt either.
Right.
don't hurt
Exactly.
either, you know.
Exactly.
And so I think it is. It's because we do care a lot more about women than men. Is that right? Is it wrong? Is it how it should be? Who gets to decide what it should be? But I
Mhm.
think even if people are thinking, well, it's understandable and morally, maybe even from an evolutionary perspective, correct that we care more about women than men. I would also argue that but that doesn't mean we should care so little about boys and men, and
Mhm.
I think we do.
No, that's so true. And I think that leads into a kind of conversation I really wanted to talk about, and that's kind of sexual abuse that boys and men deal with. And there's so many sides to it. One, it's how we have abuse and things happen to us, and the idea of telling somebody else or getting help for it because of how we men are perceived. We're strong, we're stoic. This stuff doesn't happen to us. And even if it does, just man up, rub some dirt on it, whatever, and deal with it. So one, you have these issues, whether it's rape or sexual assault or anything or domestic abuse, we can't talk about what happens to us because of how we are perceived as men.
Mhm.
So, but then even before we get to men, we can talk about boys. Sexual abuse, sadly, is rampant and it happens. And it happens to little girls. And it also happens to little boys. And I find it hard to find true studies on what happens to boys, the percentages. Is it mothers? Is it fathers? Is it foster kids? Is what's the race? All these things. Why is the actual study, the discussion about the abuse that happens to boys so little reported or written about or spoken of?
Well, I think it's gotten worse in recent years. So, for example, here in the UK in 2009, around that area, the government we had at the time published some guidance, and I can't remember the exact term of it, but it's basically government guidance on highlighting and tackling sexual exploitation of children. And whilst it was far from perfect, it kind of, in my opinion, did a good job of addressing issues with girls and boys. It talked about let's not forget boys. It talked about sort of things to look out for when boys are saying and doing things. It kind of said that boys might, it didn't word it in the best way, but it basically talks about how boys might engage less, we might struggle to engage with them and things like this is what we need to think about, okay? Now, fast forward over 10 years later, the current guidance doesn't mention really boys at all. It doesn't focus on boys as victims. It doesn't focus on any specifics. And any sort of similar guidance, from what I've seen, focuses a lot more on boys as perpetrators or potential perpetrators than victims. And so I think now there is this huge narrative, just pick up a newspaper every single week or every single fortnight, you will see a headline that basically is summarising as girls and women victims, boys and men perpetrators. And this oversimplified narrative is completely harmful. It's completely ideological. It's massively oversimplified, and it kind of excludes context. And the context that it excludes is the fact that boys and men are less likely to report. And as I say all the time when I deliver training, when it comes to male victims, what we know is that there's four, arguably five parts to kind of highlight. One, uh, male victims are less likely to be identified by professionals as being victims or potential victims. Two, the boys and men themselves are less likely, or a lot less likely, compared to girls and women, to recognise that they have been victims or are victims. Three, they are also less likely to disclose to any police or authorities what's happened to them. Four, they are less likely to engage with services that can maybe help and support them, and they are arguably less likely to be taken seriously. So, what we know then is that, so if we have a boy or a man that's been sexually abused or abused in any other ways, he's less likely to be identified by professionals because of various reasons. We might talk about that. Even though, if he is identified by professionals, he's less likely to recognise himself that he's been abused. But even if he's identified and he does recognise it, he's then less likely to disclose to official sources to pursue it. But then, even if he is identified and he does recognise it and he does disclose, he's then less likely to engage with services. But then, even if he does he is identified, he does recognise it, he does disclose, and he does engage, he's less likely to be taken seriously. So there's a hurdle at every single level. And what we are saying is, well, or what we do as society, the media, government, we fail to give those issues sufficient knowledge, and we don't really consider how those issues affect how male victims do or don't disclose. So then what we have is we don't talk about that, but we talk about all these girls and women who are disclosing. Well, of course they're disclosing. Girls and women identify with victimhood more than boys and men because of language and things, and girls and women have been encouraged a lot more to talk and discuss than boys and men. And then with the narrative of, well, boys and men are bad and girls and women are victims, of course male victims are not going to disclose as much. And so these are the issues that I think need addressing that are not addressed as some might say at all, but certainly nowhere near enough.
You said a lot there. You put
Sorry,
a lot there.
I do jabber on a bit.
No, please, no. That wasn't a complaint. That was a compliment. What I hear from that, and I talk to a lot of men doing this podcast, and one thing, and I am a victim of that also, is that I wasn't raised to be an emotional being. I wasn't raised to kind of be in my feelings, to talk about being upset, to deal with grief, to deal with loss, to deal with not getting the girl that I wanted or getting the sports team that I wanted to be on. So I feel like we already start just by raising our boys as being tough and then making it seem like any emotion is against what it should be as a boy or a man. Then you have something happen to him, and it almost feels like they don't know how to deal with it. And then, like you mentioned, you have all these hurdles. This happened. Should I be okay with it, or I just be man up? Is the only emotion I'm allowed to have is anger, as opposed to fear or shame or anything that happened? How do you feel the way we raise our boys has to do with, I guess, the road that a boy who was sexually abused has to go on?
I think it's interesting. For me, the word that comes up is vulnerability. And there are some that say, and I don't agree with this, that masculinity is the problem. Masculinity and vulnerability do not go together. And so in order to go to therapy, for example, to address the abuse that you recently or historically suffered, you have to be vulnerable, show vulnerability, express vulnerability, but actually boys and men can't or won't do that because it goes against masculine instincts. Okay. Now, I would say maybe there's a different way of looking at that. Rather than kind of blaming masculinity, what about using it? And so, yes, there are ways that masculinity can be displayed in a really harmful way, but there are also ways that masculinity can be displayed in a very positive, healthy, brilliant way, which we don't talk about. And I would argue that most of it is displayed in a positive way, a lot more than in a negative way. So rather than coming from this sort of default automatic viewpoint of you have to be vulnerable, you've got to express vulnerability, you have to, my question is, why? Why do they? And what we are doing is we're kind of promoting this one size fits all. So rather than saying to all men, and again, different things for different people, of course, but I have certainly found with a lot of boys and men that I've worked with, I said, I don't have to mention the word vulnerable. Like, you come into therapy. This is difficult for you. It's hard, but you're still doing it even though it's difficult. It'd be very easy for you to stand up and just walk out, but you're choosing not to do that. And actually, you're going to try and confront some issues that are causing you problems, to try and solve them, to try and tackle them, to try and work with them, to try and get through them. That sounds like strength, not vulnerability to me. And so actually, rather than kind of implying or saying, you must be vulnerable, just be okay with being vulnerable, I would go, well, if for boys and men that doesn't work, and for many it doesn't, abandon that and go, well, you're trying to take action and take control. So you use what we arguably call more male-friendly language. So when there's a brilliant book called the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology and Mental Health. Very big, very bulky. It came out in 2019. And when I read it, it blew my mind. And a lot of the things in this book I had already been doing. And the book just totally validated what I was doing. So I started doing more of it. And my website was very feelings, emotions, express how you feel and all that. Not that there's anything wrong with that at all. But what I then did is I changed it, and I changed all of my language, and I went from feelings and emotions to take action, use your strength, take control, tackle your problems. I saw a significant increase in boys and men coming to me for therapy, massively, to the point that I was seeing about six boys or men on average a day, Monday to Friday, and I was busy, and I thought, wow, this is working. Then adopting those principles in the therapy also worked. So, in answer to your question about what about how we were bringing boys and men up, I think it's about what is the problem. So I think the only problem comes is when you are enforcing something. So if so there's a lot of discussion, isn't there? Or there has been a lot of discussion, like boys playing with soldiers and trains and trucks. That's bad. I remember seeing someone online saying that's toxic masculinity. Absolutely nonsense. If there's plenty of research out there that we don't like to look at because it goes against the narrative. But if you have a group of young boys in one room and a group of girls in a room, but they've all got access to what you might call traditional feminine and masculine toys, you will find that most girls go towards the feminine toys and most boys go toward the masculine toys. Now, a lot of people will say that's because of how they've been brought up. And I used to agree completely with that. And I used to be very, very much, yes, it's 100% because of how they're brought up. It's not. There's a wealth of literature out there that shows, yes, society, upbringing is definitely an influence, but so is biology. And there are average sex differences between the brains of males and females, and levels of testosterone, average differences in brain structure. That plays a part in the decisions that we make. It doesn't mean all boys should be one thing and all girls should be another. It means if we leave them, they will. But what we're seeing is we then see girls doing the typical girl thing and boys doing the typical boy thing. But if it's their free choice and it feels right to them and they're not hurting anyone, why is that a problem? So then what happens, these boys become men and some of them are abused as children or as adults. They decide to enter therapy, but therapy arguably is perhaps designed more for women than men. And then what we have is you have various professionals, practitioners and therapists out there who say these men just need to open up and express their feelings. These men just need to talk about how they feel. And I'm like, why do they? That it's not one size fits all. If you're a man and you want to do that and it helps and it works, great, fantastic. But if it's not, well, then the therapist needs to be open-minded to thinking, how can I change my approach to fit with this client? And so for me, saying to men who come to therapy, you just need to open up and be vulnerable and explore your feelings. Well, it's a little bit like therapists perhaps saying to women, you just need to solve the problem, take action and take control. Oh, that would be unthinkable and we would be very quickly criticised. Why is it okay with the reverse? And I think what we just need to accept is that there are average sex differences and that that's okay. And rather than pathologising that, we can accept it and utilise it.
Wonderful. So obviously you talk to boys and men. What do you specifically deal with boys, men? Do you have women and girls as patients
Yeah,
also? Okay.
I generally work with more boys than men just because of the referrals and so on.
Sure.
But yes, I do have a number of girls and women that I work with as well. I also provide supervision to therapists who are working with various client groups. And some of the people I supervise are trainee therapists or qualified therapists, and some of them are men, women, and all that sort of
Okay. Can you talk about the differences between maybe working with or communicating with a boy who's been abused, a man who's been abused, versus a girl or a woman? What's the communication like? Do you have to use different, I would imagine, different methods to eventually open up that person vulnerability? What's it like, since I imagine you've dealt with both sides?
Well, I would also, there's not, and I say this because there might be someone listening to this who I'd be careful what I say. The differences are not absolute. It's not all men and boys. It's not all girls and women. It's on average, yeah. And that's
okay.
So on average, what I find is that boys and men want more solutions, actions, something to do. Whereas girls and women, on average, are happy to come and talk and express their feelings. Now, I've got a number of guys that also do it. They come and they talk and they just offload. Everyone's different, but if I were to look at the average differences, that's what I see. So the communication, it's more action orientated. It's use of different words. So rather than rather than express your emotions, it might be finding a different way of saying that, such as take action, take control, tackle your problems, find a solution, fix the problem. Those sorts of doing words. Interestingly as well, and this is just my own experience, I find that boys and men want and value the science a lot more than girls and women. So understand. So again, I've worked with a number of boys and men over the years where they were experienced various forms of sexual abuse from various people. A number of them sustained an erection whilst they were being abused. And they thought if the perpetrator was a male, does it mean I'm gay? They thought if the perpetrator was a woman, does it mean I wanted it and enjoyed it? Why did I get an erection? It must have been I enjoyed it. So ultimately, just having a session or two to explain the science of erections and what goes on in your brain and the differences, I found that some really value that, and just understanding what's going on, that's enough for some of them. That really is enough, and that helps. So the understanding and the sciences with it. Humour is also interesting. Now, a long time ago, colleagues I used to sort of know would say humour is a defence mechanism. If you're working with someone and they're using humour in session, that's a defence mechanism. And it can be, but not always. I often find that humour can be used to break the ice, make you feel comfortable, build that relationship with the person that you're working with. And there is some emerging research that shows that using humour with boys and men in therapy, appropriately, of course, can be useful, build the relationship, and really help someone to talk if they're struggling. The action-orientated element also goes on as well. So I find that girls and women can just sit there, look at me, and talk. I find that boys and men, on average, find that a little bit difficult. So again, we're trained to give good eye contact. Well, how are we defining good eye contact? Staring at you like this or looking down like this? It's very, very difficult. So sometimes I find that boys and men will talk whilst they're not looking at me, and that's fine. On my table behind me, I have a slinky. I have a little Rubik's Cube. I have a fidget spinner. And I find that some of the boys and men I work with find it much less distressing and not as difficult if they pick something up and they're fidgeting it with their hands. The amount of guys I've seen over the years where they come in for the first few sessions, they're very quiet, they don't say anything, it's one-word answers. But then they suddenly pick something up and they're faffing about with it in their hands. And they talk and talk and talk and talk. Which is really interesting. And there is some research to say that, when you have a little less eye contact with boys and men, they might talk to you a little bit more. Years ago, walk and talk therapy, as it's now called, was frowned upon. Whereas now, and certainly after the COVID pandemic, a lot of therapists will have a counselling session, and rather than speak eye to eye, they'll do shoulder to shoulder. And that's proved to be more popular with men than women because you're moving, there's action, you're not looking. And so you walk through the park or wherever and you have your counselling session that way. Of course, there's things that can go wrong. You've got to consider the ethics, the boundaries, how you contract for things, but it can be done. So there's all these sorts of different ways of working. I think as well, there's the validation. There's that validation. A lot of men that I see want to be validated. It's like, is it okay for me to feel like this? And well, it's not that it's okay or not okay. That's how you feel. That is how you feel, and that's just how you feel. I say how you feel is in response to probably what you think. What is it you're thinking? Because the thought might be a problem. It might not be. Let's explore that. But if I think spiders are scary, whether they are or aren't, and who decides that, I don't know. But if I think and believe spiders are scary, I will feel scared when I see a spider. Yeah? Whether that's whatever you think of that, that's just a basic premise. And so having that validation, actually, my wife was arguing with me, for example, and I just was getting really angry, and I said, I need to walk away. She wouldn't let me walk away. She put her arms out in front of the door. She wouldn't let me, and I was really, really angry. But she said, see, you've got an anger problem. Do you think I've got an anger problem? I went, well, I'm not sure if I'd describe as an anger problem, but what I'm hearing is that you tried to diffuse the situation. You tried to take control. You tried to appropriately de-escalate and, take steps towards resolving by walking away. She stopped you. And I can hear that you are really, really angry. And there's something there about, actually, I can maybe see why you might be angry as well. So a bit of validation, a bit of empathy as well. But it's about not over relying on the empathy. The amount of boys and men I've seen over the years where they've seen a therapist, and that therapist would listen to them and go, I hear what you're saying. It sounds like it's really difficult. And apart from the fact I question, is that really how you speak to people? Is that a flick? Is that a switch you've just flicked? If that's really how you speak to people, fine. I question if it is for all therapists. But I remember a guy I worked with years ago, and I was very sort of new out of training, and he was basically telling me he wanted to tell his wife that he had been abused as a child, but he couldn't. And he said he needs to, he wants to, but he knows that he can't. And my response at the time was something like, so what I'm hearing there is that it's almost like you're there and your wife's here and there's this barrier between you, and I'm just kind of wondering what that barrier to you telling your wife is. And he turned around to me and said, Phil, why don't you just ask me why? And I remember going, oh, this is scary, this is terrifying, this goes against all my training and all of that. And I remember thinking, he's not ready for therapy. Boy, was I wrong. Boy, was I wrong. Of course he was. I just wasn't ready to consider how I needed to adapt my approach to fit with what he was saying. And a lot of training was never ask why, all of that. And there's some reasons behind that. But I think for me, there's something about one size doesn't fit all. And if you've got clients, especially men, going, be direct with me, challenge me. I want a different perspective. Ask me why. Don't faff around the houses. Don't just sit there and say, it sounds like you're having a tough time and things are really difficult for you. I know I'm having a tough time. That's why I've come to see you. Okay. And so I think, whilst empathy and validation is absolutely important, I don't think we should over rely on it. Because certainly in my experience and colleagues I've worked with, it's not enough. And I see clients every fortnight at the minute that have said, I saw this therapist, they were really lovely, but all they did was repeat back to me what I said in different words. I went, yeah, we generally call that an empathic reflection. Right, yeah, I want more than that. Right, what more do you want? And can I meet those needs?
So when you were talking about, I guess, boys and men, for me, and I haven't experienced that kind of abuse, so I can't speak to it. But in my head, I can imagine maybe, like you said, the science tends to be a big thing for the boys and the men. In my head, I would imagine I want to know why somebody would do that to me. Is it something wrong with them? If maybe for a while I'm thinking maybe there's something wrong with me. So I'd want to know the science of how I deal with it, why it happens. Is there something specific about me? But then I probably would also go, what do I do about it? Like, because masculinity is a big thing with us. And with men, we're big, we're stronger. Do you ever get men who feel like that action is like, I want to do something to the perpetrator? Is revenge something that comes to mind? Is that something that is for boys?
All the time. I think sometimes it's not revenge. It is sometimes it's justice, and sometimes it's the action of doing something. So I've in my book I wrote about one guy, with permission, I should hasten to add, where he kind of wanted to explore the historic child sexual abuse he suffered when he was a kid. And he went, I just feel like I need to do something. I don't know what, but I need to do something. And what he did, he spent some of his evenings going online, going on Google, trying to find out where he lived, where he worked, if he's still working for the same company he did years ago, if anybody knows him. And he said, I don't really know what I'm looking for or what outcome or resolution I want, but it just feels good to be doing something. And we spoke about that, but we also spoke, well, let's just say that you find something online and you know that he's living at this particular address or he's working for this particular company. What will you do with that information? So whilst, you validate that need to do something and how it makes you feel good in the moment, it might also be, but what outcome does that hopefully achieve? And so that's something to kind of think about. But this is where, in some ways, sitting there and fidgeting with your hands in a slinky and engaged and using words that are more action orientated can help a lot of boys and men feel like they are doing something. And so there is that. And also as well, I find that you can change the language. So a lot of therapists might go, you don't need to do anything. You just need to be. Just be in the room and be. And again, for some clients that will work and that's fine. For some it won't. And so ultimately, rather than say, maybe, maybe you just need to be by just sitting with that emotion. Well, you can reframe that and say, what about the thing to do, perhaps, could be to let out some of that emotion. So you're reframing it ever so slightly differently. So that can work. But yeah, absolutely. And, revenge is something that a lot of boys and men I've worked with have spoken about. And I think there's something about validating that, empathizing that. Depending on how far that goes, you might have to just have a discussion about how far, what they might do. Is there going to be some significant harm? And I think ultimately it's about the different ways of getting revenge. And some might say, should we be discouraging revenge? Depends on what the word means to you versus to the client, and what does that look like. Is that there can be perhaps a fine line between justice and revenge. Sometimes it may be that actually if you do report to the police and they find this guy and arrest him and so on, that's you starting to take back control. Maybe that's you starting to get some revenge. Again, I think what some people call justice, some people call revenge. It's an interesting one, but I think you start off by certainly validating that instinct, that urge for some people to take revenge when they've been wronged so horrifically.
So I am a father of 4. I have 3 daughters and a son.
Mm-hmm.
And I know inadvertently, I do my best to raise my children all the same way, but I have 3 girls and I have a son. And I know that I treat them different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I know, and it's something I try to avoid, but sometimes it's just almost instinct in the way that we deal with each other. So as a parent, I'm asking you this. Is there anything that a parent can do, a guardian of a child? Because I don't know if there are markers, if there are specific things about specific average boys who get abused, whether it's a family member or somebody, clergy or outside. Is there something a parent can do or should be looking for in regards to their kids, maybe to prepare them better for dealing with people or dealing with situations? Anything that you can suggest?
Well, I mean, there's lots of resources out there now, and when I said lots, there's more than there used to be. But I think whether it's boys or girls, it's about letting them know what a safe adult is and is not. The things that a safe adult, what a safe adult does and says this, an unsafe adult does and says this. So if you know of an unsafe adult that's doing or saying this, who can you tell and how can you tell? I managed a child sexual exploitation service that worked with just boys for about 9 years, and we were lucky enough to be awarded various funding to create resources and educational films. And one of them that is still used today across primary schools in the UK is a resource called All Right Charlie. And All Right Charlie was developed in discussion with a number of primary schools, a number of primary school aged children, about sort of 10 years old, and their parents and carers. And so, and it's on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube. It's there. There are schools that use it up and down the country. But ultimately, it's a 15-minute resource. And the camera that you see, the screen, the camera acts as Charlie's eyes. So you go on this journey with Charlie, who is being groomed by this perpetrator, Danny. And there are bits where we say stop, and then you ask the class, if you're showing it to a primary school class, what's going on here? What did Danny do that's not okay? Is that a safe adult or an unsafe adult? And so we focus on the perpetrator's unsafe behaviour, and then say, right, so who could you tell? How could you tell? What words could you use? Because that's something that, certainly verbally, girls are generally a little bit more advanced when it comes to words than boys are. So we kind of say, what words can you use? But what's really good is you never find out if Charlie is a boy or a girl. And the point is, you don't need to know. And what's really interesting is when we trialled this in primary schools, a few years ago, some of the boy, everyone had different views. Oh, well, I saw fairy lights, so I thought Charlie was a girl. Someone else went, oh, I saw this, so I thought Charlie was... It's like, but you don't know. And they all wanted to know. And the fact that they were all really keen to know and we never told them was because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What you need to know is Charlie is a 10-year-old young person that's been groomed by Danny. It doesn't matter. And I think that's sometimes the important thing. I think if you've got boys or sons that do have this, I need to always be in control, I've always got to take charge and things like that, I think sometimes then, for me, it's about that reframing and saying, well, sometimes in life, you will be faced with problems. And those problems could vary from falling out with a friend in school to, touch wood, it doesn't happen, but to experiencing some horrible abuse. By talking to someone about that, figuring out how you feel, expressing those emotions if they're very strong, can then lead towards you thinking about what action you can take to fix this. And that shows you being in control. So it's reframing that. Yeah, but if I tell someone, it means I'm not dealing with it. The opposite. No, telling someone is how you deal with it. It's like, but if I have to go tell a teacher, that means I'm not in control. Well, no, telling a teacher means that you're using all available resources to help you take control. Yeah, and again, a lot of people use the word control. Control's not bad. You can be controlling in an abusive way. Of course you can. But you can also be controlling and take control in a really good, healthy, positive way.
That's good. That's good. With the boys, I guess the men that you've spoken to, is there, and like obviously is on average, this is not generalizing an entire, sex. Is there a difference between how a female perpetrator comes to a boy and abuses him versus a man? Is there in the boys that you've spoken to, how they come to them and how they abuse them? Is there something different with the female versus the male perpetrator that you've seen?
Well, again, my focus is on the victims rather
Right,
than the perpetrator, so I have to be
right,
very careful what I say.
right.
From my experience,
Mhm.
what I find is that women who are the perpetrators, they will use the portrayal of being motherly, caring, that female nurturing role, and slash or being some sort of seductive sort of vixen type person, if you like. I can't think of a better word to use. And
Right.
they'll kind of use that, and they'll often hide behind that. And I've worked on back when I ran the service. We knew a number of boys where they were associated with an older woman, and we were a bit concerned about what was going on. And when we would go to safeguarding meetings and you had all these professionals, not all the time, but a lot of the time, you would say, we're not really worried, we're not worried, there's nothing to worry about here. And the question I would ask, and my old staff would joke about it, I would say, if she was a man and the boy was a girl, what would you think then? And what would often happen, there'd be an awkward silence that would fall, and that silence tells you all you need to know. I'd say, you've got an adult that is doing ... You've got a child that's displaying ... Whether that child's a boy or a girl, whether that adult is a man or a woman, yes, there might be dynamics at play, but they do not justify the dismissal of the risk. And often what you then see, and this is another reason why a lot of boys and men don't disclose, they will go, oh yeah, but she was really fit. She gave me attention, and it's great. We've seen it all the time. Soap operas, people commenting on social media. Oh yeah, poor boy, he was groomed and seduced by this hot, attractive teacher. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, well, but hang on. What we don't talk about as much is where you have girls in school, and the girls are groomed by a very attractive older male teacher. And the blunt reality is that whilst some boys may like the attention from the older teacher, and those boys, from their point of view, may want to engage in inappropriate sexual behaviour, so do some girls with older male teachers. It's the same thing. But what we do is we go, yes, but that male teacher should know better. So should the female teacher.
Right.
Yes, but she's a girl. She's been abused. He's a boy. He's been abused. Yeah, but he likes the attention. She likes the attention. And so, again, whether man, woman, boy, girl, whether you like the attention or whatever, it's abuse. As simple as that. And the law is the law, and you can come up with all the ideological things you want, but there's a reason it's against the law. And so that's an interesting response that has been around for years, and we still see it every day online and all of that sort of stuff. There's lots of examples. But I think ultimately, it's the grooming process that isn't always relevant or possible, because you don't always have to groom a child. There are children out there, sadly, that sadly age doesn't matter. You've got boys and girls that will do and say certain things, and they think, I don't care if I want to go out there. Especially boys with issues like homelessness, drug abuse, alcohol issues. They might be, I say the word prepared, but it's not fully prepared. But to some level, I've known it where they've approached older men, offered something sexual for money, drugs, alcohol, that sort of thing. And because they are the ones initiating this, they're seen as less of a victim. But would you think if a girl was doing that, would she be less of a victim? So again, it's just how we take it less seriously when it's a boy doing it.
It's amazing how masculinity at times seems like it overtakes the law, or what's something that's ethical or not ethical. The fact that I am male means, and I can be a 13-year-old male, but this attractive 24-year-old teacher is raping me because I can't have a 13-year-old boy can't have sex with an adult. But it's not seen that way. And I can be honest, I'm sure us men look at it the same way. Like, oh my God, you had sex with that hot teacher, blah, blah, blah. It's how we perceive it. But if a 13-year-old boy cannot consent to sex, neither can a 13-year-old girl, but we don't see it that way. It's just perception is such a big thing when it comes to men and the things that happen to us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there have been a number of cases. I'm certainly not saying that girls who are victims of male perpetrated abuse have always got it easy. I'm certainly not saying that at all.
Right.
But what I've also seen is that where there have been a number of women who have been found guilty of perpetrating various sorts of sexual abuse against boys, I see a lot more comments from judges that I would deem very inappropriate, and I very much doubt that those comments would be made if the perpetrator was a man who had been found guilty of abusing a girl. I've seen comments where judges have said about a 14-year-old boy, I accept he was consenting. What 14-year-old schoolboy would turn down such an attractive offer? And wow, okay, there's a nice bit of minimisation. Would you have said, I accept she was consenting? What 14-year-old schoolgirl would turn down such an attractive offer? No, not at all. And again, it's we're meant to be in this area where we kind of combat the stereotypes, and here we have a judge who's maintaining that's one of many. And so, like I said, while I'm certainly not saying that these comments are similar problematic comments, I'm not saying they're never made in regards to male perpetrators and to female victims. I think we see it a lot more when the sexes are reversed.
That's true. And you kind of mentioned something that I find interesting, and I coach men and I kind of talk about situations. And one thing I find interesting and brings a lot of clarity to some situations is if you switch the sexes in certain situations, like you mentioned, if this was a woman doing this versus if a man, and it kind of helps you see how we're seen, how men are treated, how situations become okay when it's happening to a man, when become absolutely terrible when it is happening to a woman. Are we ever going to get to a point, in your opinion, where we can equalize how we see boys and girls in different situations?
In my lifetime, no, I don't think we can. And I'm hearing that, and it sounds quite negative, doesn't it? I think it also is quite realistic. I think we're getting worse, and so I don't know. I'm not sure if everything will be perfectly 50-50 equal, and I'm not sure if it should be. I also think it's a bit, I think it's a bit naive to say everything should be 50-50, because that's just ridiculous. That's just not possible. But whilst it can't be perfectly 50-50, I certainly don't think it should be 99-1 against boys and men, and it often is. But no, I think we're getting worse. Here in the UK, we have a violence against women and girls strategy. Fine, great, not wrong with that. I'm all for it. Fine, have it. We don't have a violence against men and boys strategy. We have I think it's called a position statement on male victims. But that document is called something along the lines of the position statement for male victims who are victims of crimes considered violence against women and girls. And so, even as a male victim, you can't be acknowledged without saying you're the victim of a crime that affects women and girls. But well, it affects women and girls statistically more because they're reporting it more.
Right.
Not, and it might be happening to them more, but I don't think we can say just because they're reporting it more means it definitely is happening less to boys and men. And statistically, again, every year, Office of National Statistics, various reports, most people of homicide, men.
Mm-hmm.
Most people of overall violence and violent crimes, men. Most people of stabbings in the street and overall boys and men. Most people of muggings and other violence on the street, men. So they are the main victims of that sort of violence.
Right.
But we don't have a violence against men and boys strategy.
Yep.
Very unusual. And I think ultimately, what we often do, and this might be a bit controversial, but what we often do, and I've seen various headlines and reports where it talks about we need to make sure women feel safer on the street. And men are being killed on the street a lot more than women are. Yet we put a lot more focus into trying to address how women feel about that happening to them compared to it actually happening to men. How on earth can we be okay with that? But that is just another example of how we care a lot less about male victims and a lot more about female victims.
And it feels like the dichotomy of it is that, and I've tried to figure it out, and I never will. I mean, I'm not trained to this, but it feels like because men tend to be the perpetrators, and then obviously the victims, that there's less sympathy or empathy for the victim. It feels like it's happening to us, but then the response is, well, you're doing it. And I've seen stuff like women say, oh, men are trying to kill us and blah, 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 whatever. But okay, but those men, and it's not men, not all men, it's those perpetrators are doing things to me too. I deserve protection also. I don't deserve to be vilified because I have a penis just like that perpetrator. Yeah. And the wonder is if we're ever going to get to a point where somebody, like you were telling with that thing with Charlie, if when something happens to a person, they're just a victim, not a male victim versus a female victim. They're just a person who got hurt, who got abused.
What often happens is when you talk, so a few months ago, we were in the UK, we were talking about Minister for Men. We have a Minister for Women and Equalities, we don't have a Minister for Men. And there were lots of people saying, let's have one. You know, there wasn't really much interest in it, but there were various news shows that were addressing, you know, do we need a Minister for Men? Should we have a Minister for Men? And there were people on panels talking about it. And you had a number of people saying, no, we don't need a Minister for Men, not at all. And what would happen, and it's like clockwork, when you talk about the suffering or disadvantage of men, you are guaranteed at least one of two or both responses. One, we divert away from men having problems to men being the problem.
That's it.
Or two, we divert from men having problems to women having worse problems. We can never talk about men and boys having problems without one of those two things happening. And the idea of, well, hang on a minute, just because somebody is experiencing harm, whatever it is, and the perpetrator of that harm is the same demographic as them, that doesn't undo the harm that they're suffering. You know, that doesn't undo, they're still being harmed. The harm is still severe. If a man is killed by another man, it's like, whoa, hang on a minute, let's, and it's that gender divide. A lot of the people, not all of them, but a lot of the people that talk about violence against women, they only care about tackling violence against women when it's perpetrated by men. They're very silent when it's other women. There was a story today, or was it yesterday? I can't remember, where a woman was found guilty. Somewhere, I think it was in New York. She randomly pushed another woman in front of an oncoming train. Horrible, terrible, of course. Again, whether that's a man doing it, it's a man, a woman doing it, whatever, that's bad. It's terrible. Justice needs to come. The person's alive, thankfully, but I think huge injuries. Right. But a lot of the people that would be very vocal about tackling violence against women won't touch that. A lot of the newspaper articles and newspapers, that would address that will be very vocal if a man had done that to a woman, because a woman doing it to another woman, they're quiet. It's like, well, let's just look at the severity of the behaviour and less about it. But you hear this all the time, what have men ever suffered? Like war. They were sent to war. The White Feather Brigade forced people into war. Yes, some men chose to go to war. They wanted to fight. A lot of men didn't. They were forced into it, pressured into it, and so on. What's the first response you get? Who's sending them to war? And I go, well, what you're trying to do there is you're kind of implying it doesn't matter because it's other men doing it. Well, doesn't that debunk the whole idea that men benefit from patriarchy? If it's this big patriarchy of powerful men benefiting men, no. So what happens is you have the minority of powerful men displaying misandering prejudice towards a greater number of men who have nowhere near that amount of power. And so that's the thing we have to challenge. And I often say, so actually, if someone of a certain demographic was attacked by someone else of the same demographic, would we say, well, you're both of the same skin colour, you're both the same sexuality, and so we don't care? No, of course we wouldn't. So why is it okay to do it with men? Why? It's just poor justification for prejudice and misandry.
There's a lot of justification for the way men are treated. I appreciate this conversation very much. Thank you for talking with me about this. I wanted to ask it if you would kind of give us a little info. I'm not sure if this is the latest book that you read, The Sexual Abuse of Boys and Men, Creating an Approach for Neglected Victims. Would you talk about, I know we can find that on Amazon, and I think I'll put that in the episode notes. Can you give a brief kind of synopsis of what somebody would get reading that book?
So first of all, they will see very clearly just how poorly male victims are treated. All of the issues I talked earlier about identification, recognition, disclosure, engagement, and being taken seriously, it goes into those 5 sort of themes in a lot of detail. It talks a lot about how we can utilize elements of masculinity and use them to help boys and men deal with and overcome abuse rather than pathologize masculinity. It also talks about how we in my view we should acknowledge the role of nature and nurture rather than say it's got to be one or the other, and the average sex differences between males and females and how that can play a part as well. But I'd say ultimately, just in lots of different ways, it just highlights how poorly male victims are treated and gives examples of how certainly therapists and other practitioners can work with them.
Fantastic. Okay. All Phil's information will be in the episode notes. In fact, let me kind of put this here. How can people find you? How can people, social media, website, where can somebody, if they're interested in your thoughts, where you
my website, I mean, again, my website's really about anyone who wants counselling, and due to insurance and ethical reasons, I can only really provide therapy to people who are based in the UK. But if anyone wants to see my website, because there's other videos and blogs on there, and other little interviews like this I've done, it's counsellingwithphil.co.uk or counsellerinleeds.co.uk. That's part of the country where I'm in. And if people are interested, you can see various comments from me on Twitter, and that's just or X or whatever we're calling it these days. Phil Mitchell 83. And I guess that's where you can find me.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I wasn't sure that I'd get to speak with you. I was honored when you responded when I reached out. Thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. I hope we get to do it again another time and speak. If you release another book or anything else, I'd be happy to speak with you. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate you asking me. Thank you.
Oh, all right. Hang on. Fantastic episode. I love talking to men in general because I love the idea of communication. Men, we don't communicate as much as we should. And this is a subject that I know is got to be hard to talk about. So I want to have somebody on who deals with this. So if this is something that is happening to you that you have dealt with or are dealing with, please take that step and find somebody who you can talk to, who you can be vulnerable with, or you can just be open with and talk with. I want to end this the way I typically end my episodes, to the men who watch and listen, who are dealing with a tough time because life is difficult and we know it. And you know that I know it because I was close and I was there. We get to a point in life where we feel like we have no options, where we feel like there's nothing left, there's no reason to live, and we just want to end it. And I'm here to tell you that you can't do it because we need you. There's somebody, a friend, an employee, somebody you may not even know who's waiting to talk to you, to hear from you, to see you walk in a room. They're waiting for the phone to ring so they can hear your voice. You are important to somebody, and you may not even know it. You make somebody's day, and you may not even be aware. But if you are at the point where you on your last legs, you're at the end of your rope, call, text, find somebody to talk to because we need you. You are living, you are here for a reason. And you may not have found it yet, but that's part of what life is, finding out what our purpose is. So if you're struggling, find somebody to talk to because we need you. We need all the men we can get. And I tell you this because you are a man and you are the purpose. Thanks for listening. Have a good week.